You're the one that taught me words are living things. Watch it fall.
Hi and welcome to my channel. Today I wanted to talk about the unsolved and very famous case of JonBenét Ramsey, the infamous kidnapping turned homicide. Let's just get right into it. So JonBenét was a little girl, age 6 at the time of her death, born August 6, 1990 in Atlanta, Georgia. At the time of her murder, her family was living in Boulder, Colorado, along with her older brother Burke, who was 9 at the time. So a little bit more about the family and the dynamics of the family. Her father, JonBenét Ramsey, which is actually where her name came from. It's a fancy hybrid of his first and middle name. So JonBenét became JonBenét. He was the president of Access Graphics and was actually deemed Entrepreneur of the Year. He had also received a bonus that year of $118,000, and that will come into play a little bit later. Now, her mother, Patsy Ramsey, was a Southern belle, a high society woman from Atlanta. She had actually beaten ovarian cancer at the age of 40. She was in the competitive pageant system most of her life, and actually that is how JonBenét ended up following in her footsteps. At the age of 4,
My name is JonBenét Ramsey.
JonBenét actually really loved pageants. Unlike some kids, they get very overwhelmed and feel a lot of pressure from parents, but it appeared that she really enjoyed being part of them, and she actually did very well. She won several competitions. I also wanted to mention that John had said something about him being uncomfortable with JonBenét being in pageants, and if he could go back, he wouldn't have let her do that.
The body of JonBenét Ramsey, strangled and beaten, is found in the basement.
And this was to set the scene. It was the holiday season, so it was the night of Christmas, and this was a busy time of the year for them. It was not only the holidays, also Patsy's birthday was coming up. The family was just returning home from a holiday party. They were out with friends and they were driving back to the house. JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car on the way home. When they got home, John carried her upstairs. They all headed to bed, set the alarms to wake up in the morning, and that was the last time that she was seen alive, according to her family. So morning comes, it's about 5:30. Patsy is the first one to wake up, and she starts to head down their spiral staircase. Immediately, 3 pieces of paper catch her eye. They are sitting right there on the staircase, and she picks them up, she reads them, and it seems to be a ransom note, and she just panics. Runs to JonBenét's room, doesn't see her there, runs to Burke's room, she's not in there either. At around 5:52, she calls 911.
911 emergency. Police. What's on 515th Street? What's going on there, ma'am? We have a kidnapping. Okay, what's your name? Are you Patsy Ramsey? I'm the mother. Oh my God.
And then about 2 minutes later, she starts calling her family, her friends, letting them know what's going on. And John also started calling friends and reporting her having been taken, or saying that they've got her, whatever that meant. So now to get into the details just a little bit, that ransom note was the first piece of evidence that anybody came across, and there were some interesting things about it. First of all, it was written on paper from a notepad that the Ramseys had, which would have meant that whoever had written it from inside the home, which is very odd, because if you are there to kidnap somebody and leave a ransom note, you would probably want to write it beforehand. That way you can get in and out quickly. And also the note was very long. It was about 3 pages long, and usually ransom notes are just very quick. It also had a very specific ransom amount of $118,000, which is actually the amount that John had received on his bonus.
I have never seen a ransom kidnapping that asks for such a specific amount of money.
Now, the first detective or police officer on the scene actually had John start looking around for anything that seemed out of place or anything that was missing. So she told him to start at the top and work his way down to see if he could find anything just anything that could help them in determining where she is or what happened. But the odd thing is, and this is the first red flag, John immediately went downstairs into the basement.
JonBenét's father would find her body in the basement. Her skull had been crushed, her hands and feet bound. There was evidence she had been sexually abused, and a nylon cord was wrapped tightly around her neck.
And now you have John Ramsey at the crime scene. And this is where it gets very tricky. He picked his daughter up, took her upstairs, took the tape off of her mouth. That immediately just destroys any kind of evidence, and any that there was is now tainted. Now let's talk about the autopsy. The autopsy report showed that she had died of blunt force trauma to her head. She was also strangled, and there seemed to be evidence of sexual assault or attempted sexual assault. What I also found interesting was that it seemed that she had been cleaned off, so most of the evidence had been removed. There was a drop of blood and one single pubic hair, and they removed scrapings from underneath her fingernails, and they found that this was male DNA. Now, the other part of the autopsy report that was interesting was that she had undigested pineapple and milk in her stomach. If it had been undigested, that would have meant that she ate something before she was put down to sleep, which would contradict the story that the family gave. There was milk and a pineapple in a bowl laid out on their dining room table. Patsy mentioned that she doesn't remember making the dessert or preparing it, and that the spoon was too big for the bowl, that she would have never used that spoon or put it together that way. Now, when the evidence of fingerprints came back on the bowl, it had Patsy's and Burke's on it. So not JonBenét's, but she had still ingested that food. So moving on to suspects. So definitely the parents, Patsy and John, were immediately under suspicion. They refused to talk to police and to do any kind of interviews. They first spoke publicly on a CNN interview a few days after what had happened.
I did not kill my daughter, JonBenét.
But let me assure you that I did not kill JonBenét. I did not have anything to do with it. I love that child. This $100,000 reward is for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer of our daughter.
John mentions that they did this to somewhat help take off any suspicion that was on them. Looking back, he wouldn't have done that interview because I guess it had made things worse for them. They now were under even a bigger microscope. So as far as the note and the handwriting, they compared both Patsy's and John's to the ransom note, and John's was immediately ruled out. Patsy's, there were some things that were very particular between the writing of the ransom note and her writing, but it wasn't declared that it was hers or it wasn't. They also gave hair and blood samples, and no family DNA was linked to what was found. The only thing was with Patsy, she had been wearing a blazer with red fibers, and those red fibers were found on the tape that was used to cover JonBenét's mouth. And also the garrote that was created to suffocate JonBenét, some of it actually was a broken paintbrush from Patsy's paint kit. They did live in a very nice home and in a very nice place, but still there were several sex offenders registered at the time of her death within a 2-mile radius of their home. Anybody could have been a suspect at that point. And not to mention the Pagents may have exploited her as well. So Burke, her brother, was of course another suspect. He was home at the time of the murder, and he met with a child psychologist to discuss the circumstances of the event that happened. Immediately he said, well, I know what happened to her. She was taken downstairs to the basement, and he made a gesture as though to state that a knife had been used to hurt her in some way. The other interesting thing is when they had shown him a picture of the pineapple and milk that were sitting on the dining room table and asked him about it, his behavior changed.
Can you describe that to me?
He looks like he's about to jump out of the seat, and he was like leaning all the way over.
But the other thing with the evidence is that the type of fracture she had would have had to have been created with a lot of blunt force. And for a 9-year-old, it's a little bit difficult to assume that he would have been capable of doing that. And also the knot that she had tied would have been very difficult for him to have done on his own. So the other important part is that there was no forced entry. The DNA that was on her was not linked to anybody in the family. Burke had never spoken publicly until the 20th anniversary of his sister's death. And he went on to the Dr. Phil show and he had an interview, and people really didn't like his demeanor. He was smiling and laughing through most of the interview and gave some very disturbing details of her death. Dr. Phil asked him directly if he had anything to do with her death, and he said no. And again, there was no evidence to implicate him. So as far as Patsy and a possible motive, she supposedly had moments of outrage and mood swings according to their housekeeper. And also, as I had mentioned, it was a very busy time of the year, probably a lot of stress. And JonBenét had some bedwetting issues. Possibly JonBenét could have woken up from having wet the bed, told her mother got upset and maybe in a fit of rage hurt her, and then in order to hide what had happened, they made it look like an intruder had done it. And the same for Burke. There was a theory that he was the one eating the dessert and JonBenét went and grabbed a piece of the pineapple and ate it, which would explain that there were no fingerprints on the actual bowl, whereas Burke's and her mom's are on there. And maybe he got upset and hit her with a very hard object, and then the family tried to hide that as well. But again, there was no evidence for it, and Burke being 9, with the amount of force that he would have had to use to hit her that hard, is a little bit hard to explain. And the other explanation that Patsy would always give had to do with her having beaten ovarian cancer and how having cancer really changed her priorities in life, and wetting the bed is just not something that you would get so angry about. As far as the housekeeper, Linda Hoffman, she probably did have a key, seeing as she needed to get in and get out. So her and her husband, who was also a handyman for the family, were looked into, but no evidence existed against them. And actually, Patsy and Linda kind of bumped heads a lot. Linda would talk about Patsy's outbursts and mood swings, and Patsy mentioned that Linda wanted more money and the family didn't give it to her, and that's how the $118,000 came out, possibly because Linda might have known about that, and that's how it was written to the ransom notes. So there were a few other suspects. Gary Oliva, he was charged with drugs in 2000, and they found a photo of JonBenét in his backpack, and he was a known sex offender, as well as Michael Helgoth. He worked in a nearby car salvage. There might have been a motive, and there was a piece of evidence as far as a footprint, a boot print that would have matched his. But when the police came out about a possible new suspect, he actually ended up committing suicide. So lack of evidence and his death did not permit him to be implicated for her death. Another interesting one was John Mark Carr.
John Mark Carr, the guy who falsely confessed to killing little JonBenét Ramsey.
And he just out of the blue admitted to having killed her and gave some very explicit information on how he did it. But again, his DNA did not match the male's DNA that was found at the scene. There was also a town Santa that had a little bit too much of an interest toward JonBenét, but again, nothing came out of that. Ultimately, the case has still not been solved. Patsy sadly died in 2006. Her cancer had returned. She had split up from John prior to that, and he remarried. Burke is currently a computer programmer, and he's only done that one interview with Dr. Phil. So other than that, there's really not a whole lot of information, which is why this is so frustrating of a case. It happened in her own home on Christmas. It's just so sad. And her family, whether they did it or not, I just can't imagine the loss of a child, but I really can't imagine a family member hurting somebody of their own to begin with, and then covering it up and doing such a great job with all the stress and adrenaline of the situation. I just feel like they wouldn't have done such a good job of cleaning up evidence, if that makes sense. So it's a little hard to believe that they had anything to do with it. A door could have been left unlocked. You really don't know. It could have been circumstantial opportunity. Someone was just around, you know. It's just so sad. Let me know what you guys think, and thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.